All right, I'd like to welcome everyone back to your seats, please. All right, so the last panel, which I thought was incredible, there was a lot of uh, actionable insights and practical strategies there. So thank you very much, Shannon, for moderating that panel. Thank you to our speakers for participating in that panel. But that panel really set up, what we're about to dive into now. Those creative strategies for building an audience, the creative strategies for launching your music, the creative strategies for really setting yourself up. Now, this conversation, which is Black Dollars, Unlocking U.S. Digital Music Royalties for Black Music Creators, is really going to dive into what do you do once you actually start making money? Or if you've been making money, how are you collecting all of it in this new digital era? So we're going to dive really into the ecosystem of the business around the royalties. So, with those strategies to drive audience and drive fans and drive listenership and streams, on the flip side, you also have a strategy to make sure you're actually collecting the royalties. Right now, you're sitting inside the Mechanical Licensing Collective, and that's our job every single day, is making sure that we are processing and paying out royalties to creators. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome my panelists. Cheryl, come on up. George, come on up. And Landis. So this panel is, again, Black Dollars, Unlocking U.S. Digital Music Royalties for Black Music Creators. And the flow of the conversation is really going to be sort of starting with the basics. I'm not sure where everyone in the audience and those our viewing audience, where you are in terms of your complete understanding of the music business, but I think it's good for us to do a quick crash course for the experts in here. This is going to probably be a little boring for you, but it's important to set the tone before we dive into more complex conversations around royalty streams and royalty flows. So I really want to start with the foundation, because at the end of the day, if you don't understand the foundation, you're not going to really understand how that ties into collecting what's due to you, protecting your copyrights, managing your copyrights, because if you don't really understand the foundation. So we're going to start with each of my panelists introducing themselves, starting at the end here.
Landis Brazel, entertainment attorney and assistant professor of music business at the University of Memphis.
George Munger, president and CEO of Connect Music, a music distribution company. And it's great to be next to Landis, from the best university in Tennessee, the University of Memphis.
Hi, I'm Cheryl Potts. I've been a copyright and royalty administrator for over 18 years. I'm the founder of ClearCut, which is a copyright and royalty administration platform for music creators and labels and publishers.
So each of these speakers brings a different perspective to the stage. Cheryl, who's an expert in copyright administration and a technologist building tools for copyright and royalty management, metadata management. George, who's worked creatively and on business strategy side with artists, now leading the charge for a music distributor and helping artists really understand their business. And Landis, helping artists protect their legacy, not only with what we know to be traditional music business assets, but now in this new age, we're going to talk about Web3, we're going to talk about metaverse, crypto, all that kind of stuff. How do you protect your assets in this new world order of things as we move into Web3 and the different services? So we'll get there, but before we dive into Web3, we got to rewind all the way back to the basics, starting with copyright. So I'm going to just drop this off to you. Let's start with the basics. What are the two basic copyrights in the music industry?
The two basic copyrights are your sound recording, sometimes called the master. We're trying to get away from calling it the master. And then there's also the music composition, which is the underlying song. So the easy way to kind of think about it is, if you think about the song Respect by Otis Redding. So Otis Redding wrote the song Respect. And he recorded it, and it was released by Volt, I think in like 1965. So Otis Redding or his publisher owned the music composition copyright to the song. And then Volt Records owned the actual sound recording copyright. And then Aretha Franklin recorded it 2 years later, right? So Otis Redding still owned, or his publisher still owned the music composition copyright. and then Atlantic owned the master recording or the sound recording copyright to Aretha Franklin's version. So if you think about it like that, that's kind of an easy way to separate the two.
And just to follow up on that, what about independent artists today who are writing their songs and recording their records? Do they own both copyrights?
So independent artists do own both copyrights, right? So the moment you record a song, you put it in tangible form, you actually have a copyright interest in that. There are, I guess, benefits you get from registering with the Copyright Office. But the minute you put something on paper or you put something, or you record something on a hard drive, as long as it's original and it's fixed in a tangible form, is what they say, then you actually own a copyright interest in that.
Perfect. So the very first thing we need to know in terms of music money is our assets. And as you just explained, we have 2 copyrights and the musical work and the sound recording. Now, if I was an independent artist, I create I write my song, I go in the studio and I record it, and I have these assets. How long do I own my copyrights?
So it's 70 years. Well, it's the life of the person plus 70 years. So if you have like multiple writers, so if you co-write a song, it's the life of the longest living person plus 70 years. So generally, that's how long you have. And then if a company owns it, it's a little different. It's either 90 years or 120 years. But for the purposes of this, the life of the author plus 70 years.
That's great. So, you mentioned collaborations. I'm going to actually jump over here to Cheryl, because I think with collaborations, or you say you write with multiple people, you just have to start thinking about, how those things are split up, right? So Cheryl, I want to talk about the 2 different types of publishing royalties that come from that copyright ownership: performance royalties and mechanical royalties. How are PROs splitting up and paying out those royalties to creators and rights holders?
The PROs of the performance rights organizations split out the royalties from a writer and a publisher. If you are collaborating with others, let's say I own 25% of a song, 4 of us written a song, then when I register with a PRO, I will split my 25%, so 12.5% will go towards my writer registration, and then the other 12.5% will go to my publishing. So it's always split in half based upon my writer ownership.
And again, for those who may be watching and don't know, what are the PROs in the U.S.?
PROs is ASCAP, BMI, CSAT, and GMR.
And if you're not a member of a PRO and you write songs, then already you're potentially leaving half your publishing royalties on the table. So diving a little bit deeper, you talked about the PROs paying out on a sort of a half goes out to the publisher share, half goes out to the writer share. I want to throw this back to you again, Alandis. Again, if I'm an independent artist and I'm writing the songs and I'm putting it out, which of those halves do I get to grab?
So as an independent artist, you're getting it all, right? But from you're getting mechanical and performance royalties from the writer side, right? And then you're getting artist royalties and just like plays from the sound recording itself. Is that the?
Yeah. Okay, great. George, so you're currently working with artists to help them with distribution strategies. What's your artists look for in distribution and distributors?
Yeah, I think that every case is different based on the size of the artist and what services that you need. I think that when you have a distribution company, for example, and maybe I should go through the revenue source before I jump into that. So just from a revenue source, to Alandis's point, there are 2 copyright. So this is the master or the recording. You as an independent rights holder would own that and have the right to go and monetize that across streaming services, Apple, Spotify, Sirius XM, Pandora, interactive and non-interactive performance sources. And when you earn that revenue, that money is paid back either to the label or directly to you if you're using a do-it-yourself distributor. I think, again, depending now on the size of what you're doing and what you're working on, it's important to find organizations that aren't just a technical provider. Anyone at this point in digital music distribution can get your music to the streaming service. Some have 3 or 4 different middlemen in between that could either slow down the delivery and or chop up revenue. Something to be aware of as you're looking for distribution partners is if one is saying, well, we're going to pay you 80% of net income we receive or something of that nature, because that could indicate that there's a third party that they're having to pay a fee to. So then once they get the money for you, they then pay you the remaining share of that income. I think most importantly is how do you build services around projects that you work with. I'll use my own company, a shameless plug here. My own company, we are an invite-only service. We look for clients who we believe are moving out of that do-it-yourself space more into that middle tier, and or we're seeing artists that are leaving kind of the major label environment but still need that artist or label services support to help push their release and infrastructure, marketing plan, rollout, financing for their marketing and the like. So there are a set of things you might want to look for in summary. Can they get your product out on time? Do they have team that can support and augment the release to help benefit how that product comes out? And then are the terms those that are equitable? Is it a one-time flat fee up front? Is it a revenue share and a services fee? Do they provide any additional capital as you scale as an individual artist? So those are kind of the 5 things I'd look for.
Thank you. So just a quick recap of kind of where we are. We're going to pivot and talk about some fundamental principles, but we start with the idea that you have this copyright, this asset, right? And as you stated, you have this asset once you affix original work of authorship in a tangible form. Then you have to go and affiliate with the proper music rights organizations in the United States. At the MLC, we represent the administration of the digital audio mechanical license, which is generally basically your royalty from digital streaming services. Cheryl talked about PROs, which is representing the performance right and the performance royalty. And then on this master side or the sound recording side, you have partners like distributors who help you distribute those royalties, those sound recordings, and collect those master side royalties. So basically that's the fundamental in the digital music era. That's really your fundamental partners. You have something to add to that?
I just want to add one thing. So to the question you asked earlier a little bit, when you own copyright interest in something, like you own what they call a bundle of rights, right? So you have the right to, and you really control the right, for anybody to reproduce your music, right? So you have the say in who can do that, who can distribute your music, all right? Who can publicly perform your music, who can publicly display your music, which is like lyrics, right? Who can make derivative works, which is sampling or recreating your song. And then there's also like one for there's also a digital public performance right for sound recordings. But the thing to remember there when we're talking about fundamentals is that as an independent artist, you control all of that at the beginning. And then every little piece of paper you sign or every deal you make is kind of dealing one of those rights away. So that's always something that you have to consider when you're working with, when a deal is put in your face. What are you dealing away? What are you giving up control over, or what will you be kind of delegating to somebody else? So.
I think that's a good point, because a lot of artists, obviously this concept is abstract. This idea that you have this asset and that you're in this business, that idea is abstract because it's really, you're starting from a creative passion perspective, and then you have to move into this business perspective. And I think what you said here, everything you sign, and it doesn't mean sign, sometimes just clicking on something, especially as terms of service, for any kind of platform, that, by clicking on the terms of service, you agree, it says that, or by, signing up, you agree to the terms of service. Everything you're signing is basically some type of grant of rights to a third party. You're telling them that I'm granting you one of these 5 rights, 6 rights that we just broke down. The right to distribute my song, the right to reproduce my song. When you upload it to a social media platform, read the terms of service, it says you're granting us these rights, right? So you're already issuing licenses, whether you know it or not. You're already issuing licenses with every platform that you're operating on. And then you have third parties that issue licenses on your behalf, like PROs, for example. So understanding that whether you want to be in the business or not, you're in the business the moment that you start putting your music online, whether it's social media or DSP. So let's talk about, we're going to move into talking about royalties, but before we can talk about royalties, we have to understand how there's a connection between your assets, your music, and then what becomes a royalty entitlement, right? And that connection, that link is called metadata. So I'm going to actually bring up Cheryl to talk about metadata. Like, what is metadata, and what should an artist know about that?
Artists should really learn, if you're not familiar with metadata is crucial to obtaining your royalties. A lot of royalties that are missing or in the black box is because your audio track that's being distributed and released is missing critical information, such as the possible songwriters or composers that are in, which is not included in the audio track on the data. You may have the artist information. You may also have the record label, but you're missing the underlying, the composer, who is the songwriters, the publishers. You can also include your IPI numbers or other critical information for the underlying song and the sound recording. There's various tools out if you don't know how to include this critical information. There are tools available. You can search as easy as if you're on a Windows machine, right click under properties and details and include that information, your artist name, your producer's name, your record label name, the songwriters, all of the songwriters' names, and other critical information to be included in that audio track before you distribute. And this way, when it comes time to paying royalties, that critical information is already included, especially from the sound recording and the publishing. As we talked earlier, there's two different copyrights included in that audio track. There is the song copyright or the composition, and then the sound recording, which is the master or the record label details. So it's very critical to add both of those details in the audio track prior to distributing, and so everyone can get paid the right royalties.
So in addition to making sure that your audio files have the tags or metadata, there's also places that need to receive that metadata. And George, you can jump in here or show as well. But what are some of the places, the entities that need to know who wrote on this, who produced it, who are the session musicians and engineers, who owns the publishing in it that we talked about? What are those organizations, entities?
Sound Exchange will need this information because it provides the performer and the sound recording owner, i.e. record label or whoever owns that audio track. Also, the MLC would need this information because it would provide details for interactive royalties to be distributed because it has the songwriter, the publisher in that audio track, so they can also distribute the royalties.
And let me just add two other notes to that. When you're working with your distributor, most of them will deliver the DDEX message to Sound Exchange, checking the agreement or the term before you check that terms and conditions box to see if they do that on your behalf. The other item that I think is one that we continue to see perform really well in helping kind of liquidate that black box is micro synchronization for when you deliver that record, for example, to YouTube. YouTube pays an additional royalty separate from a mechanical or public performance. There's an actual micro sync royalty in YouTube. And so there are companies that will monetize that. And I'll just use an example, kind of $1 for our company was a guy who had over 140 million streams and never collected more than the first $1,000 he was paid for that producer royalty. Since that time, he's generated with us about $70 some odd thousand in income. in monies that he didn't know existed just from that one source across his catalog. So that metadata is critical.
So I'm going to turn your attention to the screen here, if you can see it. So we talked about not only the assets and the different organizations, but I'm going to dive into what we call the digital music royalties landscape. At the MLC, the MLC is a new organization which we were formed after the passing of the Music Modernization Act of 2018. But some people don't understand where we fit, right? Some people are aware that we exist, but you may not understand where we fit in the overall landscape. So this digital music royalties landscape graphic is actually available on our website under the resources page, but I'm going to dive through it really quick. So we started this conversation breaking down the two assets, right? We talked about musical works, and under musical works, Melandis talked about the fact that we have a certain set of rights, which include the right to publicly perform a musical work. In the music business, we call that public performance. That generates a performance royalty, which is captured by the organizations Cheryl talked about: ASCAP, BMI, CSAC, GMR. And then it's paid out in two buckets: one publisher share and bucket two writer share. So already, just talking about the first asset, musical work, and the one right under that asset, public performance right, you already have to understand all of that business, right? Public performance is a business in and of itself, right? Public performance includes live performances on stages up and down Broadway, live performances in stadiums. It also includes live performances in little bars and speakeasies and coffee shops. It also includes your performances on broadcasts. So whether it's you doing a live stream or on television, it includes performances of your songs on digital services, whether it's Pandora or Spotify. So it encapsulates a lot of different types of performances. Then you have the other two rights that Alandis mentioned, which were the right to reproduce a song and the right to distribute a song. Those two rights together, we call a mechanical right, which generates a mechanical royalty, right? So we already have 3 of the 5 rights he mentioned represented here. Your right to reproduce and your right to distribute is combined in what's called a mechanical license or mechanical royalty. In the United States, we have now the new blanket license, which is administered by the MLC. That means that all the songs that a DSP operating under the blanket license is using is covered in this new mechanism, which is the blanket interactive license. So the MLC pays out the mechanical royalties in mechanical shares. Cheryl talked about your metadata, the ownership behind those works. That information has to get to all these organizations on the screen. If you're a member of ASCAP, ASCAP needs to get your metadata in the form of a work registration. The MLC needs to get your metadata in the form of a work registration. And there's also a number of companies that handle direct and voluntary licenses with the DSPs and other types of users. Now, we also talked about another asset, which is the sound recordings. Under sound recordings, it also have the right for distribution and reproduction, but we look at that as master sales. And that comes in the form of streams and downloads, as well as temporary downloads or tethered downloads. George, representing distributors, deals with this every single day. Is making sure that sound recordings get distributed, but not only do sound recordings get distributed, making sure that they can receive those royalties that are coming from those DSPs, right? So if you've released a song to Spotify, there's some royalties flowing over to ASCAP. There's a little bit of royalties flowing to MLC. There's a bunch of royalties flowing to your distributor. So now you have to understand that these are different buckets. Even though you're talking about 2 assets and probably 1 creator, if you're an independent artist who writes a song and records it, you have 1 creator, you have 2 assets, you have 4 buckets now, right? The further down we go, the more this keeps breaking up, right, and getting fragmented. So understanding that you have to understand it from the top to the bottom. Distributors pay out directly to artists if that's their client, or to a label if the label is their client, and then their label would pay the artist. And then Cheryl mentioned also Sound Exchange. Sound Exchange has been around since the 90s, collecting digital performance royalties for sound recording. That's digital radio, Pandora, cable radio like Music Choice, Sirius XM, yeah. internet radio like Pandora, satellite Sirius XM. So they're collecting digital sound recording royalties for performances, and they pay out in a different structure. What I really want you to notice is that third row where you see the buckets, those buckets represent the way in which these entities pay out. Those buckets, you need to be in those buckets, right? If you wrote the song and you recorded the song and you distribute it under your name or your own label entity, and you have your own published name, publishing entity, well, you have to be in each of those buckets to collect all those digital royalties. If you're only in 3 of those buckets, you're only collecting from those 3 buckets. And then you have these other buckets, which Cheryl mentioned, we call black box, where they don't know you exist, right? Because the work isn't registered or you haven't become a member. So this is basically your digital music era where we're in right now in the US. Any comments on from any of you on this breakdown or?
No, this is great.
All right, great. So again, for some of you who already know all this may have been fundamental, but a review is always fresh. I teach at UCLA, and refreshing myself on this stuff over and over is how you know that when you read a contract, you know in your head what's not in the contract. When you know they're like the back of your hand, you can see a contract and not only care about what's on the page, but what's missing from the page, which is the most important part of reading the contract, is understanding what you're not getting. Not only what you're getting, but also what you're not getting. And what's on there, what it should look like, right? All right, so I actually want to jump into before I move on, I want to jump into some key insights that I learned at the Black Music Summit, the State of Black Music Summit, which was put on by the National Museum of African American Music last week. I thought it was a really great summit, but there were some incredible data points that I want to highlight today. So again, this was from the National Museum of African American Music State of Black Music Summit. Last year, U.S. recorded music statistics. So last year, there was $15 billion in U.S. Recorded music. This includes physical, digital, so all platforms. So 15 billion. Now, of that 15 billion, 83% of it came from streaming. So your Spotify, Apple Music, your YouTube Music, Tidal, Pandora, so forth. So 83% of it came from streaming, which gives us $12.45 billion in revenue for the US last year. Now, what's interesting to note is that Black music genres make up over 30% of streaming. So then that includes hip hop, R&B, and jazz. Now, we know that Black music influences other genres, but in this particular case, we're still using this framework of Black music being limited to R&B, hip hop, and jazz in terms of how we still look at genres, right? That's why this conversation is still going on in terms of what is Black music. If pop artists are appropriating Black music sounds and generating income from that, should we not look also to how pop is growing from samples of hip hop beats and so forth? But that's another conversation. So 30% of streaming is from Black music genres, which makes up $3.82 billion. So that $3.82 billion is a quarter of the recorded industry revenue from last year. Black music generated 25% or 25 cents per dollar from all recorded music in the United States last year. This is super important for us to understand not just the impact of Black music from a creative standpoint, but the ownership gap as it pertains to the socioeconomic benefits of Black music. Do you think the top 100 Black music artists earned close to $3.8 billion last year alone? Right? So when we talk about the fundamentals, understanding copyright ownership, master ownership, how do you license and give away your rights with every contract you sign? Also think about the opportunity that is the ownership of your music. The ownership of Black music last year made $3.8 billion, which was a quarter of all music, but did the distribution of Black music royalties go out to the creators of that music, right? We know that there's a gap between ownership and the creation, right? It started from, as we mentioned in the beginning, the very first panel, poor label deals, where artists are getting 12 cents on the dollar, maybe now 15, 16, 17 cents on the dollar. If you look back 100 years ago, it was nothing.
5 cents.
Right? So, if Black music is generating 25% of value in the music industry, we have to really look at ownership. How does that value trickle down back through this? Is it getting all the way down? Is it skewed to certain buckets, whether it's publishers or labels? Are you the publisher? Are you the label? There are some artists who have done creative deals. I'm going to ask you about this, Melinda, sorry. Where artists are licensing their music to labels now. Can you talk a little about that versus licensing versus the traditional label deal?
Yeah, so the traditional label deal is you sign as an artist, and by signing to a traditional label deal, generally the label will own all of the sound recordings, will own all of the work that you do. Well, now a lot of artists are either investing their own money in the recording and then going to a label that has a nice distribution network to say, hey, let's work on this. You have the marketing power, I have the creative power. Let's put this out together. And they're retaining the ownership of their music, or they're just finding label partners who do those types of deals. And there are a lot of labels in town who do that. And that's really kind of where the industry is going, with a lot of these progressive labels who are actually trying to work with artists and trying to push music forward. They're partnering with artists, saying, we'll front you some money. And then after they front the money, they'll figure out a way to make that money back. But in making that money back, they'll revert ownership, right? Or they'll share ownership of the sound recordings with the artist instead of just taking full ownership of that. And I think,
just going to say, Dae, to the stat that you have here, $3.82 billion of income value, real value that Black music has. What this has caused really in the streaming space is alternative financing and opportunities for independent creators, where the ownership rights are retained, and it does become a licensing transaction. In fact, if you look at it, music, the rights that we're creating is really being viewed as an asset class. Late last year, the SEC, for example, ruled on the composition that it, in fact, could be fractionalized as if it was a stock. In fact, it was a song from Memphis, Hit the Quan, was the first record that was done with. And then on the master recording side, you're seeing more and more the flexibility in the distribution space for financing. We just rolled out, 2 weeks ago, our own financing up to $1 million for assets that ensure that the creators, Black creators, are able to retain ownership of their rights. And I think we'll continue to see that as some of these things we're going to get into, Web3, and some of these things start to take place.
And I think what that means for the artists, and this is probably another panel as well, but what that means for the artists is really finding a way to, one, get wise counsel. And I'm not saying I'm just an attorney. I'm saying just build a team around you of people who know the industry and make sure you learn the industry. But also having patience, right? Because you're going to get, you're going to get excited when you get that first deal offer in your hands. I got a record deal. I got an offer. I got to take it. And you're going to be afraid to walk away from it. But when we see the folks who are taking advantage of these licensing deals, often those are the same artists who have turned down 3 or 4 deals before that to get to that licensing deal. So when you get a deal in your hand, the first deal might be the deal that you take. I don't know. But when you get a deal in your hand, make sure that you look past the excitement of it. Be excited, but also make sure you have a team. Talk to a lawyer, talk to a manager, talk to somebody who's in the industry. So as what Dae was saying, you'll know what's not in that contract, right? Because that's what's important. And if you don't look at those contracts a lot, you won't always know what to look for. So.
That's incredible. So, now I remember when we got into 2020, well, before the pandemic hit us, but back in 2019, right before we went to 2020, I did a presentation called Music Music 2020, the next era of innovation in the music industry, where I had been speaking on this for about 2 or 3 years prior, forecasting some of the innovation that will have popped up by 2020. Obviously, I think we had a 1-year gap, and now we're seeing some of the things that I talked about at Music Biz, and one of them included tokenization, blockchain. We talked about cryptocurrency, and since then, we've now, in the music industry, there's been the introduction of NFTs. So I want to pivot this conversation now to the Web3 space. For anyone who's unfamiliar, heard of Web3, there's a lot of different descriptions out there about Web3, but the real concept and principle about Web3 is decentralization and really ownership of creation, monetization of creations, whether it's art, whether it's music, whether it's graphics, visual graphics, and the interactivity between systems. Not just computer systems, but also communities of systems or systems of communities. So this is still a growing space, Web3, and it includes different categories of innovation, cryptocurrency, NFTs as sort of digital assets, blockchain as a infrastructure in terms of building upon the technologies, and metaverse, which are these digital ecosystems in which we can create ownership of digital land and build upon it, transact with digital currencies in this space. Whether you're doing a concert in a metaverse and earning coins from that particular ecosystem, your ability to extract that coins into real world value is cryptocurrency. So it's a lot going on right now, and there's some artists who've already have made a lot of money in that space. But it's important to understand that this is still kind of the new frontier where not only have a lot of opportunity, but there's a lot of scams. So I want to talk, practically speaking, one or some examples of what's happening in Web3. So I'm going to start just down the road here and just give me some examples of what's currently happening in the Web3 space.
Yeah, something interesting that I've seen is, well, there's a site called One Of, right? I think it was started by Quincy Jones, and I think John Legend might have something to do with it as well. But I think they put out a series of Whitney Houston NFTs. And this is actually interesting because it's actually not connected to copyright really. It's connected to like her publicity rights, which is another set of rights that artists have. But they put out an NFT that generated a lot of money with I think maybe like a picture from her prom, right? So people bought like a serialized version of that picture or the rights to a serialized version of that picture. So that just kind of showed the creativity that a lot of estates can have and a lot of these legacy artists have when it comes to, creating NFTs. They also had an NFT attached to one of her songs, but like a demo recording of her song to have ownership in that as well. But it's always interesting to kind of see how.
I was just going to say, hopefully, if you were paid in Bitcoin, you sold it before. Well, never mind. But no, you just to the Web3 space, I think is going to be really interesting. The more that music is incorporated in it, because what I was having this conversation the other day. Whatever that digital world is, it is still using our physical world copyright, and so I think we've got to make sure that in all of these metaverse that are being created and such that we make sure that there's infrastructure to monetize these rights that we still, our creators and rights holders still possess in the real world. And I think that's going to be a real opportunity though for artists, one, to get creative with how they might bring in income and revenue, because again, the NFT from likeness, it's a great way to control your rights, but have money to drive awareness and build the profile of who you are as an artist. So it's a great mechanism.
But the key again to that is knowing what rights you still have, right? And controlling those rights, because a lot of times, like you might get approached by somebody to create an NFT in a song, right? If you have already signed a publishing deal, right, you're gonna have to go back to your publisher to get permission to do that or to clear that, right? If you have some type of merchandising deal, you might have to go back to the merchandiser to get clearance for that. So and if you have a recording deal, you're gonna have to go to your label to do that, right? So again, none of these deals are bad, but you need to make these deals flexible enough so that you still have some type of administration say so, right? That's really the big takeaway from that.
For me, I've been looking at some very new platforms that are being built on blockchains, such as new streaming platforms, such as Audius or Rocky, that are promising higher streaming revenue from their platforms than the current platforms today, as a Spotify. And they're really focused on a lot of the fan base, and the more that your music is played, the higher tokens that you get, more tokens that you would get from on streaming on their platform. So I'm always looking out for new ways that Web3 is bringing about in platforms.
And I think those all are important. And it kind of goes back again to ownership. If you have the ownership and you have these rights, the 5 basic rights or 5, your bundle of exclusive rights, these are things you can do to monetize or exploit those rights. The metaverse Web3 space shouldn't sound scary or foreign. It's simply just another way of distributing and monetizing your content, of building communities. We've gone through this in cycles for decades, right? The whole digital era coming out of the 90s, right? Before that, it was just physical, right? And I believe it was 2015 when digital finally overtook physical in terms of revenue. It was 2020 when when interactive streaming took over, or maybe a little bit, interactive streaming took over digital downloads. Maybe been a few years back, but 15, okay. So 15 was when streaming took over from downloads. And I think it was probably around 2010 or something when digital altogether took over from physical. But the point is, there's been a handoff from innovation to innovation, from piano rolls, to eventually, 8-tracks like my grandparents used to have, and a little 8-track player, and vinyl, and then cassettes and CDs and MP3 players. I don't even use an MP3 player anymore, right? Does anybody use an MP3 player anymore? Right, I remember that came out. It was a hot
Apple
thing,
discontinued theirs,
right?
So.
MP3 players. So there's always something new. But now I'm starting to see these, interesting, multiverse VR experiences around music, whether they're in some metaverse experience. So it's just another type of innovation, but it all sits on the business, the copyright, right? Who owns the right, and who can grant those rights, and in exchange for what, right? That's the basic fundamental principles. Whether the innovation sounds scary and foreign and new, it still sits on the basic fundamental principles that we've talked about this whole time. Who owns the copyright? How do you distribute the assets into the metaverse, right? Because eventually it's going to be distributors focusing on that. There's already distributors launching NFT platforms that enable you to mint NFTs, right? It's just a new way of distributing your content and your ideas. It may not necessarily be music. It may be an image or likeness. They all need to have some way to identify the owner, right? So metadata. Let's talk about metadata in the Web3 space. Like, what should an artist know about metadata and what?
Before you move on to that, was one thing you pointed out about rights. We talked earlier about granting distribution rights, and be careful with some of these agreements to make sure you don't grant, for example, physical rights. We're seeing more and more their short-run vinyl and other opportunities that can generate significant revenue to your targeted fan base. Be cognizant of that in your distribution agreements, that you're not granting a physical right to someone who's not going to be putting up a check to help you manufacture those assets. So just thought as you talk about all the ways that you can monetize an asset.
I was calling Cheryl just to talk about, even though the Web3 space is still growing as this new creative and kind of content. I mean, there's still, this panel is not on the whole scams, but also make sure you look out for scams, rug pulls, situations where people are just kind of doing money grabs, right? Because since it's not a mature sector of the industry yet. It's what digital was many years ago when labels had new media departments, where it was like, it's just a catch-all. For anything that was digital, it's in a new media department. We're going to explore that thing. We're going to invest a little bit into it, but we're not really sure how to properly license it, how to properly regulate it, we don't have any, it's not set up properly yet, but we want to dip our toe in it. Or the music is already being pirated in these spaces, so we need to catch up to the fact that there's demand. even though we don't have an infrastructure to support it. So, but from the metadata standpoint, which again goes back to who owns it, who did what, how do you credit people? There's different services that are using blockchain as a way to keep a record of this asset ownership and how it change in hands. There's a thing called smart contracts that basically are if then that sort of scenarios on how to give access to something or take away access to, or grant rights or take away rights in real time. So understanding all of that is important. I just want to open it up to anyone at this point to talk a little bit more about the sort of the bridge that we're on right now from the digital music era to the Web3 extension. I wouldn't call it a different space, but it's really an extension of what's been going on over the last 20 years since labels had to stop suing college kids and instead start licensing and negotiating with the tools that college kids were creating. So now we're in that same space, but labels and publishers learn hopefully from then, and they're now already engaged, actively engaged. Every other week is a headline of someone doing a collaboration with or investing in some Web3 experience. So that tells us that at least we learned from 20, 25 years ago of, you can't just whack-a-mole it into a submission.
Well, and I think just to that point, Warner Music, for example, we've seen them buying metaverse, investing in metaverse. This is something we all should be leaning in to identify as many sources of revenue as independent creators that you can identify for monetization. This thing is, to Dae's point of the new media department, find time in your week to serve as your own new media department to dig in and understand what's on the horizon. This thing is moving fast, fascinating, and absolutely an opportunity to generate new income.
It's a new way to generate, I guess, recurring income, right? Where some of those opportunities didn't necessarily exist before. Even if we talk about the sale and the resale of music, right? We're doing like a lot of streaming now, but if you sell and resell, or if you attach an NFT, say to a vinyl record, for instance, right? And then every time you sell that vinyl record, that NFT goes along with it. You can now put something in there where the artist or the label will get some money from that sale, where, before that was not the case. There's something called actually the first sale doctrine in copyright. Pretty much once a copy of something is sold, that's it. The original owner does not make money from it again. But NFTs actually kind of open up the door for that. So you can kind of be creative and say, all right, I want to do a limited run vinyl, right? I want to do 250 copies of vinyl. I'll mint 250 NFTs to go along with it. And then as that transfers, you're getting paid off of that, from jump. So there's a lot of like opportunity there for things like that if you kind of pay attention to what's going on, and if you're not learning it, get somebody on your team who does, right? So
I also want to add that what's different about the Web3 space that's different from the kind of the pivot from physical to digital is that as a general public, we're not looking at it as simply a new form of music consumption, but rather a new way to engage with artists and their content. So community, which was talked about in the last panel, community also has to be at the forefront of whatever kind of Web3 strategy you might develop, in the near term or in the future. Community meaning it's not just about, let me just do a money grab, let me throw an album out there in an NFT and never follow it up with any kind of value, because an NFT is supposed to be, you have to understand how the audience is viewing your NFT. Is your community looking at an NFT as a one-time transaction to get your album, or are they looking at it as a buy-in into your brand? And is that NFT going to give them access to future things? Meet and greets or a follow-up bonus album or whatever. Like, you have to understand, like, how is my audience viewing this NFT? Some people are using NFTs as assets that they can hopefully make a profit on by the resale of that NFT. So if you're putting out an album and NFT, and then you don't follow it up with anything, then there's no more value being added to that NFT. So if someone thinks they're going to sell that NFT for more value or for a profit, you have to build that kind of relationship, right? It's almost like a partnership with your community. So don't look at metaverse NFTs or NFTs as just a way to distribute and monetize music, but rather as a way to engage a community, as a way to build a community, as a way to engage a fan base. So I'm going to open it up now for questions on anything we've discussed. I know we covered a lot. Let's go ahead and call it.
Yeah, I want to go back a little bit to when you were talking about metadata. I work in copyright and concord, and I see it a lot where we have like specifically rappers where they deliver PKAs when we're trying to do music in, like with the weather and not their actual name. So also independent artists, so can you just talk a little bit about how independent artists should go about making sure that the metadata is right for these like digital aggregators, like TuneCore, CD, digital, and how to make sure that information is correct so they can collect their royalties and they don't have to.
I believe that the artist should actually put that metadata in prior to distributing to distributors. So when it goes out into the different services, the metadata is already embedded in the audio file.
Well, and just if they're using a DIY platform, everyone that I can think of from CD Baby on, ask you who the writers are. That data is delivered in the ERN message that's delivered to the streaming partners. So, but the other piece is, to your point, these guys cannot put in artist name and then in the writer name put in their artist name. They need to put in the legal name because that's who needs to be paid, not the professionally known as. So that's just that education piece. Use your government name.
And I'll actually also add that information in. I think a lot of people just miss that step a lot of times at distributors. They just add their artist name and they don't put in the songwriter's name. They don't put in the producer's name. You really have to take the time and manage that and make sure that details is in while it's getting ready to be distributed.
And one other point to that for independent creators, there are a couple companies out, two that come to mind right away. There's a company out of Nashville, Viva Sound. They do RIN, which is release information notes. So you can do it in the session, same as a Memphis-based company, Sound Credit. So I know those two companies do that, and there are others that you can do it right in the session.
And it helps if you're consistent with the information that you put into. I think that's a big one. Like just making sure that, if there's an apostrophe on your PK, there's an apostrophe every time you put it in, just like simple stuff like that, I think will go a long way.
In addition to your name, we have unique identifiers in the music industry, right? So your name can be someone else's name too. There can be two John Does, right? But how do we disambiguate between these two creators? So knowing your identifiers, we have the IPI number, which is interested party identifier, which is a number that represents you as a songwriter, which is assigned to you by your PRO. So if you're with ASCAP or BMI, they're going to assign you an IPI number. That's sort of like your social security number in the music industry as a songwriter. But then on the artist side, as an artist, you have what's called an IPN number, international performer number, right? So that's your persona as your stage persona. Right. So as a songwriter, it's your legal name and an IPI number. As an artist, it might be your PKA. You're professionally known as something, and you have a performer identifier. So already that's two different identifiers you need to be aware of. Let me give you an example. When you're born, you're given a social security number, which is your legal, right? But then when you go and register your name, and it may have changed into the DMV, we call them DMVs, but you get a driver's license number, right, for that name. And if you change your name and get another driver's license number, there's a new code for that name, but your social security number remains the same. That's kind of like the difference between you as a songwriter and you as an artist. Every name gets an identifier, but you as an individual might have one. And then your music gets identifiers. When you register your song, when you register the metadata in your songs with the PRO, you get what's called a ISWC code, International Standard Work Code. That is basically the identifier that should go along with that song. Everywhere you put that metadata, that ISWC code should be there as well. the recordings have their own code, ISRC code, which is International Standard Recording Code, which represents every recorded version. So there's several different codes out there. You can actually go to our website, mlc.com, and go to, I believe, resources, and we have a dictionary that breaks this down, plus some videos. But it's important to know who your collaborators are, know that you need to embed your metadata, and then know what your codes are. There was a couple other hands I saw before. Go ahead. Well, I'm gonna just repeat your question just to make sure I understood it, and you can tell me if I'm right. You want to understand as a creator, how do you go about using public domain music? Okay. Gotcha. Do you want to jump in on this?
So generally, music falls into the public domain when its copyright protection has expired, right? So we talked about how long copyright lasts. So the person's lifetime plus 70 years. After that 70 years, generally that's when something will fall into public domain, right? And you can check. I mean, there are places you can check. You can look on. Kind of look on Songview right now to kind of see who owns something and when something was written. You can go to the copyright office to see when something was registered, and that'll kind of give you some basic information about when it was registered, who owns it, and you can kind of make determinations based on that, because that copyright ownership and when it falls into the public domain kind of changes. And I won't get into the math now, but it changes just depending on when it was written as well. So.
I wanted to say the exact same thing, because sometimes in old copyrights you have renewals also. And for instance, the Happy Birthday song that was very, very popular, we all singing that Happy Birthday song, it was just fought with a film writer wanted to record Happy Birthday in their film, and one of the publishers still owned that song. And this filmmaker turned around and challenged and went to court. This is only about 3 or 4 years ago, where it was finally challenged that there was a period that the owner of the song did not actually do a full renewal. And up until just a few years ago, you had to license the song. And you would think that Happy Birthday would be in public domain years ago. But it wasn't, because the publisher kept saying that they kept renewing the song. So you have to be really, really careful. Do your research to make sure that song is actually in public domain, because it may not be.
Yeah. And we run into this a lot with a lot of traditional music too. At the University of Memphis, we have a record label, High Water Records, a lot of Delta blues music. There are multiple versions of songs that have been recorded by our artists. There might be multiple copyright registrations from different songwriters. And a lot of times they're traditional songs, right? You mentioned fraternities. I mean, a lot of these are chants that have been used in one way or another, right? They might have been used and modified by all the different fraternities, right? So it's sometimes hard to kind of figure out what version you're actually reproducing.
All right, thank you. You just hit the time. We're gonna break for lunch now. If there's any other questions, we will be roaming around. So this is the networking brunch sponsored by BMI. Thank you so much, BMI. If you're hungry, join us for lunch in the back. Thank you. Thank you to all my panelists.
Thank you, Dae.
Thank you, Dae.